As we've been discussing, Plato's Republic asks, what is the best kind of person to be? What characteristics are good for a person to have? What kinds of behaviors are good for a person to do? And what makes those characteristics good and those behaviors good? We see one answer offered by Glaucon and first defended by Thrasymachus in Book 2 of the Republic. And Glaucon tries to show us using the Ring of Gyges as an example that what's ultimately good is an individual's benefit. Satisfying your individual desires is what's ultimately good. And anything else that's good is only good because it contributes to that goal. If that's the case, if that's what we're ultimately up to, trying to satisfy our desires, then the best kind of person to be is one who can get whatever they want. They'd have to be good at manipulating other people. They'd have to be strong. They'd have to have force of will, and that's the sort of person that Thrasymachus thinks it's best to be, and that Glaucon is making the case that it's best to be at the beginning of Book 2. But Socrates wonders, is there anything but our individual desires to follow when it comes to deciding what's best? Could there be some objective standard that guides the choice of how to be and how to live our lives? Socrates, of course, thinks there is, and he gives us a second strategy for thinking about what we mean by best life or excellent person. He thinks that we can find what makes us good, what makes a characteristic good somewhere else. And Socrates gives us two conceptual tools that he thinks that we can use to think more systematically about what would make a life the best life, or what would make a person an excellent person. Those two tools are the concepts function and virtue. Now, when dealing with a philosophical text, it's good to understand first what we mean by concepts like this. And after we have a more thorough understanding of what these concepts mean, we can try to understand what they tell us about our topic and how they can help us think about our big question: what's the best kind of life to live? Socrates introduces these two concepts towards the end of Book 1, on marginal page 351D. So let's go ahead and see what he says. Let's look at the text, and then let's dig into it and try to understand what he means by the concepts function and virtue. Tell me, do you think there is such a thing as a function of a horse? Socrates asks. I do, replies Thrasymachus. And would you define the function of a horse, or of anything else, as that which one can do only with it, or best with it? I don't understand. Let me put it this way. Is it possible to see with anything other than eyes? Certainly not. Or to hear with anything other than ears? No. Then we are right to say that seeing and hearing are the functions of eyes and ears. Of course. What about it? What about this? Could you use a dagger or a carving knife or lots of other things in pruning a vine? Well, of course. But wouldn't you do a finer job with a pruning knife designed for the purpose than with anything else? You would. Then shall we take pruning to be its function? Yes. Now, I think you'll understand what I was asking earlier when I asked whether the function of each thing is what it alone can do or what it does better than anything else. I understand, and I think that this is the function of each. All right. Does each thing to which a particular function is assigned also have a virtue? Let's go over the same ground again. We say that eyes have some function. They do. So there's also a virtue of eyes. There is. And ears have a function. Yes. So there's also a virtue of ears. There is. And all other things are the same, aren't they? They are. And could eyes perform their function well if they lacked their peculiar virtue and had the vice instead? How could they? For don't you mean if they had blindness instead of sight? Whatever their virtue is, for I'm not now asking about that, but about whether anything that has a function performs it well by means of its own peculiar virtue and badly by means of its vice. That's true, it does. So ears, too, deprived of their own virtue, perform their function badly. That's right. And the same could be said about everything else. So it seems. We'll take a few passes at what Socrates means by the concept function. And with each successive pass, we'll try to deepen our understanding of the meaning of that concept. So here's our first pass. Socrates says that something's function is what that thing does. And he goes on to say it's what it does best, or what only it can do. Let's deal just with the first part. Something's function is what it does. By that, Socrates means the function of something is its purpose, or the role that it plays. Let's take Socrates' first example. He looks at the eye. To discover the eye's function, we need to ask what its purpose is. Now, we should notice eyes do lots of things. Eyes move about. Eyes will tear up, and eyes will lubricate themselves. Those are all things that eyes do. But none of those things that eyes do are the eye's purpose. The purpose of an eye is to see. What distinguishes the purpose of an eye from the other things that it does is that all of the other things that an eye does, moving around, keeping itself lubricated, etc., it does in order to be able to see. So the fact that eyes have muscles that contract the pupil, the fact that eyes move about, the fact that eyes stay wet, all of those other activities that eyes do, they do in order to see. So this leads us to our second way of characterizing the concept of a function. What a thing's function does is explains why it has all of the other properties that it has, and it explains why those properties are organized in the way that they are. Let's stick with the eye for just a moment. The muscles behind the eye that contract the retina are the way that they are precisely so that they can cooperate with all the other things that the eye does to make vision possible. Moreover, the reason that those properties are there in the first place is because they facilitate sight. If all the things that an eye does didn't facilitate sight, the idea is then those properties wouldn't exist in an eye. So, first pass. A function is roughly something's purpose, or the role that it plays. Second pass. What something's function does is explain why it has the properties that it does, and it helps us understand why those properties are organized in the way they are. It's a little easier to see if we consider a second example that's not an eye, something a bit more familiar. Let's consider Socrates, an example Socrates will use later, a knife. What is the purpose of a knife? A knife is for cutting. Now, what properties does a knife have? Well, it has a blade, it has a handle, it has a long stem. Let's just talk about those three. Now, the reason a knife has a blade, what explains why knives continue to have blades, is so that a knife can cut something. If a knife didn't have a handle, we wouldn't be able to hold it, we wouldn't be able to cut anything. So what explains why the handle is there? Well, because knives have the function of cutting. Likewise, let's talk about organization. The handle of a knife is on one end so that you can grip it, and then the blade of the knife is facing the other way, or excuse me, is on the other end of the knife. The reason that they have this spatial distribution is so that you can hold the knife and cut at the same time. Imagine if the handle were, if there were just a handle and then the blade of the knife were on one side of the handle so that you'd have to grab the handle with one side of your fingers. You'd end up cutting your hand and you'd never be able to cut anything. So the reason the handle and the blade are separated is so that you can easily grab the handle and it will accomplish the purpose of cutting. So we use the word, we can use function, the concept of a function, to help us understand why certain properties of things exist. Like we can ask the question, why does a knife have a blade? Well, we might answer, so that it can cut. Or why is the handle set up like it is relative to the blade? Again, so that it can cut. Purposes, functions, serve an explanatory role. Third pass of the concept function. You may have noticed that Socrates says that everything, each thing, has only one function. Its function is what it does particularly well or what only it can do. He says, only eyes can see. Can you think of a couple counterexamples to that claim? Take a minute and see if you can come up with anything else that is able to see, that's not an eye. Perhaps you thought of cameras. We've developed new light-sensitive materials that can be wired into computers and that allow them to process and create images. We hope someday that we might even be able to create what we call an artificial eye. It might not be made. It won't be made of, or perhaps it will or won't be made of genetic material, but you could imagine it being totally mechanical, and it would be sensitive to light, and then it would wire information into our brains. But it wouldn't be made of the stuff that an eye is made of. Now, what Socrates is saying by using the concept function is that even that mechanical device would still be an eye. What he's doing is he's using the concept function as a way to define what something is. The nature of a thing is its function, Socrates is claiming, and Plato is claiming. So what makes an eye is not an eye is not the fact that it's made out of this squishy biological stuff and that it's, it looks like we expect an eye to look. Socrates thinks that eyes could be made of lots of different materials, and they could be set up in lots of different ways. As long as they serve the function of seeing, then whatever it's made of, it would be an eye. We can capture this in a short little slogan. What something is not what it's made of. It's not its matter. Function defines something's nature. Let's consider the same point from another angle. We might think that Socrates is wrong to think that everything has only one function and that that's what only that thing can do or what it's best at, by just considering the fact that if we go back to our knife example, we can use a knife in lots of different ways. So sure, when we're using a knife to cut something, like a piece of cheese, knives are for cutting. But I can also take that knife and set it on a piece of paper that's blowing off my desk. Now the knife is a paperweight, and the knife is for holding the paper down. You can use a knife for any number of other things. You could use a knife as a crowbar. The purpose of, if something gets stuck and you wedge the knife into a crack and exert some pressure and then pop out whatever the rock that was stuck in whatever, in whatever crevice you're trying to get the rock out of. In that case, the knife is for prying. So it seems like a knife can do lots of different things. So why should we think that the function of a knife is cutting, that knives are for cutting, and not for holding paper down or for holding or for prying things out? Well, Socrates' solution to this problem is to say, sure, a knife is heavy enough to hold a piece of paper down, but why does a knife have exactly that weight? Well, if a knife were very heavy, I wouldn't be able to pick it up and cut something with it. But if it were too light, I wouldn't be able to, might not be strong enough to cut through whatever I wanted to cut through. So the weight of the knife is actually explained by the fact that the knife is for cutting. The knife having that weight makes it capable of cutting well. Right? Likewise, a knife being sturdy enough to pry something out of a crevice, we didn't make knives sturdy so that we could pry things with knives. We made them sturdy so that they wouldn't bend and break when we tried to cut through things. The point again is that the knife has all the properties that it has Because its purpose is to cut things. The purpose of the knife explains why it has those properties. And because it has those properties, sure, we can use it for lots of other stuff, but it wasn't those purposes that explain why we gave the knife those properties in the first place. So, something's function explains why it has certain properties. And sure, those properties might be good for other stuff too, but that's just a matter of pure luck. To make the point concisely, the knife wouldn't have the properties that make it good for holding down paper if those properties weren't good for cutting beforehand. So it's the purpose of a knife that explains why it has all those properties, and that's why the knife's purpose is cutting, and not the other things that it just so happens to be able to do. So to summarize, the three meanings that we've discovered function has. First, function means roughly what something does, or the purpose of the thing, what it's for. Something's function explains why it has certain properties. And something's function, Socrates thinks, makes that thing what it is. To be an eye is to be capable of seeing, however that's accomplished. To be a knife is to be for cutting, however the cutting is accomplished. You can go on the internet, if you type in cutting knives, you'll see that they're set up in lots of different ways. The setup doesn't matter. It's the fact that all of them are for cutting that makes them all knives. What about the concept virtue? Virtue is an English translation of the Greek word arete, and it means excellence. So when we hear the word virtue, you might think of the sort of we think of the classic Western examples of virtues, like patience or courage, etc. And those all are virtues, but it means something broader. It means excellent. So the virtue of something is whatever makes it excellent as an instance of its kind. Now, virtue can be connected to the concept of a function. What makes a knife an excellent knife? Well, Socrates thinks, an excellent knife is one that can cut things well. So, a virtue is a property of an object, or a thing more generally, that enables it to perform its function well. Let's take a moment, think of a few virtues of knives. An excellent way to explain a virtue of a knife will be to first identify a property that the knife has, and then to explain how having that property enables a knife to perform its function well. Pause the video and see if you can think of 4 virtues that knives would have. Here are just 2, and as examples, an excellent knife is sharp. A sharp knife it will cut through things well. If a knife's dull, it won't cut through things very well. We've already got an example of a second virtue. An excellent knife is not too heavy. If a knife were too heavy, I wouldn't be able to pick it up to use it to cut something. Likewise, we said if it weren't heavy enough, it might not be too. It might snap under the weight that we exert when we try to cut things. So an excellent knife will be just the right weight for cutting. And you'll notice what makes the weight the right weight is that it's a good weight for it to be to cut stuff. Let's consider another example. What about a hammer? What are some virtues of hammers? First, we need the function of a hammer. Let's, just for the sake of staying on the same page, articulate its function as follows. Hammers are for driving nails into wood. What properties would a hammer have that would make it able to drive nails into wood well? Well, here's just one. The hammer would have to have having a flat face might be a virtue for a hammer. If the face were round, it would slip off whatever you were trying to strike, and it wouldn't be able to drive nails well. So having a flat face might be a virtue for a hammer. the length of the handle of the hammer might also be a virtue, because having a hammer that's just long enough will enable you to produce more force without making the hammer too heavy. There are lots more examples that we could think of, but the general point is as follows. When you're trying to explain what the virtue of something is, step one is to identify its function. Step two is to identify properties that enable it to perform that function well. And step three is to explain how having those properties enables that thing to perform its function well. Those properties are called virtues. Before we move on, you should pause the video and come up with at least two more things. You can pick anything. And articulate the function of that thing, and then see if you can come up with 3 or 4 virtues that that thing would have. I'll give you one example to get you started. Socrates talks about horses, so you could think about the virtues of a horse, or perhaps the virtues of a pack dog that's going to pull a toboggan. Pick something. We talked about hammers and tools and stuff, so pick something other than a hammer or tool and try to articulate its function and what a virtue would be. After you pick something like that, try to pick a kind of person. A waiter could be a good example. What is the function of a waiter, and what virtues will a waiter have? We'll discuss these examples, or we'll discuss your answers in class and think them through together. For now, what we need to know is, how do these conceptual tools help us think about our original problem? What kind of life is the best life to live? What kind of person is it best to be? The key is in the words best or excellent. When we say so-and-so is an excellent person, Socrates has just suggested that the word excellent or virtuous or virtue has to be understood relative to something's function. So if we want to know what makes an excellent person, then what we should ask is what the function of a human being is. Excellences, or virtues of a person, will then be those properties that enable a human being to perform its function well. Socrates applies the conceptual tools that we've been talking about to the problem on page 353D, marginal page 353D. So let's give the text a read. Is there some function of a soul that you couldn't perform with anything else? For example, taking care of things, ruling, deliberating, and the like. Is there anything other than a soul to which you could rightly assign these and say that they are its peculiar function? No, none of them, Thrasymachus replies. What of living? Isn't that a function of a soul? It certainly is. And don't you also say that there is a virtue of a soul? We do. Then will a soul ever perform its function well, Thrasymachus, if it is deprived of its own peculiar function? Virtue, excuse me. Or is that impossible? It's impossible. Doesn't it follow then that a bad soul rules and takes care of things badly, and that a good soul does all of these things well? It does. Now, we agree that justice is a soul's virtue, and injustice is vice. We did. Then it follows that a just soul and a just man will live well, and an unjust one badly. Socrates, at this point, still hasn't fully told us what justice is, but prior to the sections we read, he was able to get Thrasymachus to admit that whatever justice is, it must be a virtue. So, what Socrates is saying here is that if a virtue is a property that enables something to perform its function well, and if justice is a virtue, then justice enables human beings to perform their functions well. It enables them to live well. Let's summarize Socrates' reading in this passage and stop there. First, everything has a function. A soul, or what's this we might say is the same thing, a mind, is a thing, therefore a mind has a function. The function of the mind, or of the soul, is to rule oneself and to live. Therefore, those properties or characteristics that a human has that enables it to live well, to stay alive, and to rule itself well are virtues of the human soul. They're the characteristics that will make a human being excellent. Socrates hasn't yet told us what the virtues are, so we don't really have a picture of the best kind of life. What he's done using the concepts of function and virtue is he's told us where to look. If we agree that the function of a human being is to live well and to rule itself, what we need to do are try to discover those characteristics that humans have that enable them to do those things well. And that's what we'll get in the rest of the book. Okay, so what should you be able to do at this point? After watching this lecture, you should be able to explore